when you are able to regulate your nervous system and you're not seized by this fight or flight, when you're self reverential and connected to the rhythms of your body, you just have more resilience to go through challenges in life, whether they're just ordinary challenges or if there's been a lot of trauma or loss or you're going through an illness. It gives you more of a well to meet that.
Hi, guys, and welcome back to the Thick Thighs Save Lives podcast. I'm Kelsey.
Hi guys, I'm Rachel. We have Donna Brooks here for you today. You guys were wondering about somatic yoga and somatic movement therapy, and we brought you the best of the best. She is a somatic movement therapist and educator, a yoga therapist, and embodied meditator who has 40 years. Okay, you guys, this is hot. This just came to be hot now, but she's been knowing. She's been doing this for 40 years, counseling and coaching in movement and the healing art. So we brought you the very best of the best, Massachusetts living. And she is going to give you all the info you need to know about somatic yoga. So welcome, Donna.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Pleasure.
Donna, I'm excited to ask you a bunch of questions about somatic yoga and how you got started, but also learn, like, not just for our listeners, like learn a lot as we go, because I actually don't know a lot about this. I've always been very interested in doing more yoga because I always feel better after. I'm like, Kelsey, you feel nice. Like, it's so much more aligned. So I'm excited to learn about this type of yoga. So can you tell us just a little bit? I know that somatic yoga has a big attention for the health and fitness industry right now. But before we dive into that, can you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you into this field?
Yeah. So when I was in college, long time ago, SUNY Stony Brook, I danced and I really got a bad knee injury. And so I started to do yoga and it really rehabbed my knee injury. And as I was saying earlier, I got pretty early on thrown into Iyengar yoga, which it was fantastic. And it really, I credit Mr. Iyengar, BKS Iyengar, with bringing the whole alignment aspect to yoga that everyone takes for granted now. And so I got very heavily into yoga, but I missed movement. And because I had been a dancer and I was living in Washington, D.C., and I went to the Feldenkrais Center of Washington, D.C., and Feldenkrais is in the big umbrella of somatic movement. And for the first time, I discovered how very gentle, mindful movements that change the way your body does its habits, its norms, could have a profound effect on my life in many, many different ways. And with yoga specifically, I discovered that gentle, conscious, intentional, mindful movements set the stage for easier and more effective asana. And that is how I got into somatic yoga. I broadened my experience and understanding of somatics. I worked with pioneers Emily Conrad Daoud and Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who's a very important teacher to me, and also Thomas Hanna. So within the umbrella of somatic movement, it's so I love this. I hope this makes sense. Thomas Hanna said this, that mostly in our society, we look at the body as an object, right? Like you go to fitness class or you go to yoga class and it's do this, make your body do this. And in somatic movement, we're experiencing our living body. So, yeah, of course, you're still like doing something. Like, for instance, I might move my arm in front of my hand, right? I mean, my hand and my arm in front of my face. But then I explore. It's like, okay, if I turn my head and my hand to the same direction, how far do I go without any strain? I bring them back. Now, if I do something slightly different that takes away my normal habit, how far I go without it being a stretch, without having some people get pain in their neck or pain in their shoulder, I take away that habit by splitting the arm in one direction, the head in the other direction. I do that mindfully. So I'm talking now, so I'm not fully mindful, but I'm feeling these counter movements. And then when I go back and do the original movement, voila, all of a sudden I have so much more flexibility. I didn't need to stretch. I'm just giving my body information so it can experience an easier, more integrated path of movement. So it changes my yoga. If then I was going to, do something that would involve a lot of arm stretching, it changes my yoga. But more importantly, it changes my mind. I'm calmer and I have more of a sense of my body being an integrated whole that I live in, that I feel. So I don't know, guys. You can let me know if that makes sense or not. That's.
It sounds like the goal. That sounds like every goal, just to be more connected, I think, to our body as a part of what we're doing and not a separate, we talk a lot about on the podcast about the way that you talk to your body and the way that you talk about your body, and it is always especially seemingly with women, this sort of outward, I hate this, or I have to exercise this away, or I want to make this smaller. But it's not spoken about so much in a way where it's part of us, it's our vessel, it is us. And so I really like the idea of sort of the goal being just to move in a way that you're in full connection, just feeling your body as a part of you. And I think that's something that a lot of people really want to experience. And so I think that that is a really good opening to our next question, which is when we talk about, a lot of people have had some exposure to yoga, but when we talk about somatic yoga compared to regular yoga, what are some of the differences? Where do we start to have a separation between those two practices?
Yes. Well, I'd like to say a couple things. So one thing I would like to say is that we have this cultural problem where we almost think our bodies are just what carries our thoughts around. Like sometimes we experience emotions and they're in there too, but we identify ourselves as our brains. And really, and this goes back to my meditation teacher, Judith Blackstone, that the only way we really experience life is through our body. We don't really know what anything is except through our body, but yet there's this cutoff. So part of what happens is I don't think yoga is innately anti-somatic, like I don't think it is, but I think the context in which we do yoga in our society makes yoga just be like any other discipline where there's an ideal presented, right? Like it might be an ideal body. A lot of people have complained about the oppression of yoga that, in India, yoga was basically a male activity. Women didn't even do it. But in the West, it's this, perfectly thin, incredibly pliable body that everyone's trying to achieve. So I don't think that's inherent to yoga. I think that's our cultural overlay of it, if that's making sense. And then also how to perform yoga. So I was crediting BKS Iyengar before with bringing intelligence about how the body moves to yoga. And there are realities of intelligence of how the body moves, which I'm sure you know as fitness trainers, which I'm assuming you guys are. The problem is it's less about knowing that there is intelligence about the body moving. We think that intelligence kind of is, there's no flexibility around it. And with somatics, you're feeling where your body needs to go from the inside out versus having someone tell you this is where your body needs to go. So can I give another example maybe?
Absolutely.
This is a little example. So that's just what's coming to mind. But say like I'm doing something that involves, this is a common thing with yoga. So, here's a warrior pose, and people will say like, square your hips, right? I mean, that probably happens in fitness a lot too. But if I square my hips, I can feel this kind of tension in my lower back here. So, okay, well, to my intelligence and my experienced body, I don't want to do that. I don't want to square my hips. So I come to understand that actually the two sides of my pelvis are doing something completely differently. They're working in opposition. And it might look like my hips are squared, but now they're not exactly squared, and I don't have that pressure in my back anymore. So here's understanding the intelligence of my body, but not making it rigid, hip squared. Also, it won't look the same on every single body. So if we can learn to respect what the differences are in our bodies, the outside doesn't look the same.
I think that addresses a lot of what people feel when they feel frustration kind of around yoga or yoga practices, or even some just general movements with our bodies, is that my body is not going to look the same as your body when we're moving. First of all, I am not nearly as flexible. We have very different body types. It's going to feel different, and it's essentially going to be a different type of benefit if I'm trying to make it look like another person. And I think a lot of times, just kind of in our culture, when it comes to going into a yoga class or starting to practice yoga, we can feel some type of frustration because there's a lack of mobility. We're trying to get to, what seemingly everyone else in the class is doing. Probably not. That's just your perception because everyone is experiencing it in their own way. But I do remember going into a couple yoga classes and being like, wow, I'm just not good at this. I feel good, but I'm not good at this. And then that whole idea just kind of creating some like bad feelings, almost like shame and comparison, where the
Oh,
whole
yeah.
idea is the opposite of that, is to align with yourself, not to compare or try to be like anyone else. Like those are literally like the total opposites. So I love how you brought that, how you explained that in the way of like, okay, square your hips. It might sound good in theory, but for some bodies and some movement, that's actually not, it's not this general, this is exactly what you need to look like when you're practicing yoga.
Yes, absolutely. And I have a video on my YouTube channel. It's like something like, oh gosh, do this before you practice bridge poses or something. And the thing is, like, for instance, our lower back arch. So everyone has a lumbar arch. The naturalness of the degree of that arch is particular to the shape of our pelvis, the shape of our spine, the shape of our hips. So if you're, let's say, going to do a back bend in a yoga class and you're thinking like, okay, I got to take some of this arch out. It's too big. So I'm going to grip my butt. I'm going to pull my tailbone down. I'm going to stick my chest forward, all to minimize your lumbar back arch. Well, guess what? You can actually lie down on the floor, and you could see this on this video. I wish I had a link of it. These very gentle pelvic tilts, mindful breathing, oh my gosh, all of a sudden my lower back shape takes on its form. I've released my habits of tension and holding that interfere with my naturalness. So yes, there's still like saying like, okay, little body, come along. Let's try this little exercise and see how it goes. And the body likes these movements because they're easy, they're gentle. And then you have a different shape. You have your shape. You're not having to try to make it happen. And I think that's basically what somatic yoga is that with a skilled practitioner, you can kind of coax the body into taking on something it doesn't usually take on and have a fairly dramatic change in a small period of time. And then when you do your asana, it's different, it's alive, it's easy, it's not, well, I mean, you can still challenge yourself physically, but you don't have those kind of conversations that you're talking about, like, I'm bad at this, or this isn't working, or I can't make my body do that. No, your body's gonna come to do what it can and express itself.
Mm. So when we're looking at two of the different, like we're saying, like, say I'm very familiar with yoga, what the main difference when I'm taking somatic yoga, like what would you say is the main difference people will notice when they're going into that class versus another?
Well, I would say that what people have reported to me from doing somatic yoga is often it's the first time they've actually enjoyed doing yoga. Um, I would say that it's really regulating of the nervous system from the get-go. So, um, for a lot of people, yoga is a struggle till the end, and then in shavasana, it's like, oh, that was really great. Now I feel really good. And so when you do somatic yoga, you start to feel really good from the beginning because it right away regulates the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is you know, you can call it the fight, flight, and freeze nervous system. You could also call it the stimulation and relaxation nervous system. But for a lot of us, we're overhyped a lot of the time. And so if it takes an hour or 2 hour yoga class to get unhyped, or it could take 5 or 10 minutes and you're already realizing how much more deeply you can feel at ease with yourself. So I would say those are the two primary things. I work a lot with people so it's my practice is a lot of older people, younger people who come to me are often just have a lot of pain or trauma. And so this is the other effect of approaching somatically is we're not trying to go into the pain and kind of, meet it and work through it. And sometimes that's totally appropriate, and I respect those approaches. It's just not what we're doing in somatics. We're finding the pathway that's easy and intelligent for the body.
That was a really beautiful explanation. Like that gave me like a really clear picture of what to expect, because I totally align with the like I'm struggling. We get to the shavasana and I'm like, okay, fine. Like, but I've struggled for 45 minutes.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's a really beautiful explanation. You did kind of allude to some types of therapy in there. So I did want to talk about movement as a form of therapy. And this is something we speak to our listeners about for years, but it's often in the way of external movement. So how is external movement different from internal movement? And do most people utilize this area when thinking about their own like well-being?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think external movement is great. Like, so I'm not a purist. I'm not just like, oh, we're too objectified and we have to go inside. It's really important to push your body appropriately, right? To, get enough aerobic exercise, to build strength with weights. I'm really into all that. And I will also say, my son passed away 4 years ago suddenly, which was like devastating. And um, so my husband's a cyclist, a bicyclist, and that was amazing. Like a lot of I felt so angry and so distraught, and I needed that like externalization of movement. I wasn't, after the initial intensity wore off, I was able to be more within and gain a lot of value from that. But initially, I just needed to move. So I'm all for external movement. I think it's great. I think that you can use your palette of internal movement, your self respect, your embodied understanding of what your body really needs, the intelligence of how the system actually works. I think you can use that to do your external movement. So, like for instance, I worked with a woman earlier today she's been hurting herself working out. Like she's just been in a lot of pain and inflammation. And so we're just even breaking things down to very simple integrated movements so she can do weight training again without hurting herself. I think I got a little lost here. I can't, because you mentioned something about therapy too. I don't remember that, but it's not an either or, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And the internal is kind of your home base, because that's when people get really lost and hurt. Like I heard you guys talking about like imagery, right? Like, so yes, as women, and I mean, my generation certainly had it hard, but I think your generation had it even harder. Like it's so much more quick to compare everything. And there's so many more images flooding of like, what's the perfect woman or whatever. And so it's easy to get lost in that. It's easy to get lost in, trying really hard to do something that you think everyone else is doing physically. So I do think the internal somatic, the self-sensing, the self-embodiment, the self-experiencing helps us to meet those challenges, whether they're, the assault of pictures or whether they're the challenge of like, you really want to do, whatever Tough Mudder or something. You really want to do that. But how do you do that without hurting yourself or overstraining yourself? The answers are found by being like cleaved to yourself, your body as yourself first. And with trauma too, like obviously a lot of people have a lot of trauma, sexual trauma, medical trauma. It's amazing to me how many people are like, have some kind of procedure and never recover from it fully, and then they're dismissed.
So when you are able to regulate your nervous system and you're not seized by this fight or flight, or sometimes it's not fight or flight, sometimes it's excitement, like overstimulation, right? Like you just want to, do everything. Then it's like that throws you off your game. So when you're self reverential and connected to the rhythms of your body, you just have more resilience to go through challenges in life, whether they're just ordinary challenges or if there's been a lot of trauma or loss, or you're going through an illness. It gives you more of a well to meet that. So I'm just a huge proponent of somatic movement because I just feel that there are all these different categories where it just really builds intrinsic resilience and strength.
Just a quick interruption to give you some leggings.
Did you guys know we own a legging company?
Did you guys know about this?
We own a fitness apparel company. And if you haven't checked us out yet, we are constantly variedgear.com. We've got the absolute best quality workout gear that you have ever put on your body.
Ever. Leggings, shorts. We have 3 different short styles, 2.5 inch, 5 inch, and 7 available for you guys. Several different bra styles for all of your impact needs. And we want to give you a code today for all the new customers. If you haven't tried out how amazing all of our apparel is, we want you to try it out for 15% off. So we're giving you a code. It's new 15. Apply it at checkout and it will give you 15% off your order.
You know, you referenced some of your own trauma and how, this practice has helped you through. And so much of what I've seen from somatic, practice and just people sort of promoting it is this sort of idea of the ability to access trauma or meet trauma or sort of flush some trauma, is just how it's sort of being relayed to me in the sources that I'm seeing. And I was just wondering if you could kind of talk about this for a second, because there has been a lot of attention. Like, are we gonna cry? Is it a crying thing, Donna?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
mean,
All right.
crying is, I mean, you don't know. You don't have to cry. I mean, no one like, I'm sitting there waiting for people to cry, you know?
I just want to know what to expect from this. I'm like a planner. So, like, do I need to like expect to have a massive emotional sort of experience?
It depends. So there are talk therapists who are also incorporating somatic. They call it somatic experiencing a lot. And so they're wanting you to, you're there to work on your trauma. And so you're bringing your body into the conversation about the trauma, right? Which isn't normal for talk therapy. That's just never been normal for talk therapy. Sometimes that, in my experience, so I don't do talk therapy, but people who have been in talk therapy or who use me as an adjunct to talk therapy, they're not getting in their bodies enough to really feel like they can approach that trauma, right? So, yes, in that case, it's like they're really deeply getting in their bodies with me. So sometimes that trauma comes up and there's shaking or crying, or the freeze comes up, right? Like, oh my God, it's here. How do I navigate it being here? And so we have to work with regulating the emotions through the body to do that. Other times, I mean, people come in because they want to be more exuberant. There's a whole field of somatics that's just dedicated to the arts, right? Like, how do you tap into a deeper vein of yourself so you have more expression and more authentic expression, more creativity? And in that case, yeah, maybe some crying will come up, maybe not. I mean, it's not a volcanic experience necessarily, but part of embodiment is that we feel our emotions. And the thing is, some emotions are harder to feel than others. At different times, emotions are easier, harder to feel. One of the gifts I think I've been given through my years is just the conceptual understanding that emotions are kind of like weather fronts. Like, someday, I know you guys get to live in Florida now, so you don't have to experience, but just think of how you feel when like a blizzard's coming. Like, you might feel excited, but also dreading it, right? But then, spring comes and you're just in ecstasy from, the sun and the flowers. So that's how our emotions can travel through us too. But if we're very rigid in body and thinking, the emotions tend to stay. And then we try to push away the depression, or we try to push away the sadness. But if we can experience them safely, then they don't need to keep following us around. So flushing.
I love how these two worlds meet.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, because I did years as an individual therapist, and some of the things that I found to be specifically problematic was that a lot of people were storing their trauma in their bodies. Obviously that seems obvious, but when you talk to when you're in like a therapeutic sense and you kind of try to talk to other therapists about it, they're like, well, just like talk about it. And I'm like, well, here's the thing, it's really being expressed physically, and the trauma we're talking about is a physical trauma. So that makes a lot of sense, right? Like,
Totally.
like we're
Yeah.
storing this trauma in a very physical sense, but we're not allowed to address the physicality in the sense that I was in, like that we weren't allowed to address that. We were only allowed to address the social, emotional, or mental aspect of that. And I'm like, well, we're really not addressing a whole person,
Mhm.
because this is how they're storing it. This is how their problematic behaviors are even being presented,
Yeah.
in a way of like in so many different ways. But a lot of people really struggle with food and how they're going to consume, like, just general nutrients, how they're going to consume food, but they have a lot of trauma around food, or a lot of control that they're utilizing with food, control they're utilizing with their bodies. And then it's all the trauma that's really just stuck in there, and we're looking to just kind of put layers over it in order to maintain, instead of really addressing it. So I love how, bringing those two things together and thinking about, like, you know how is our trauma being stored in our bodies? How can we address it in that sense? Like, how can we feel? So, like, Rachel was asking, like, am I gonna cry? Like, maybe.
Yeah,
maybe,
maybe.
maybe.
I just want to
um
know.
yeah, but like, it makes so much sense that some people have a strong emotional response to this type of therapy, because they're getting this release in their body that they weren't able to get sometimes in therapy, in
Yeah.
just talk therapy. They
Yeah.
weren't able to access it.
And
And it's like we keep trying to pull.
I think when it happens a lot in talk therapy, it's because there's a feeling of safety with the therapist. And so when you look at it from a somatic movement point of view, well, yeah, developmentally, that was the basic thing. Ideally, we're born, we bond with the parent, and the parent helps us bond to the earth and to gravity. So, but again, in our culture, so many people are really not connected to safety on the earth. So there's a visceral experience of joining with gravity and then having a relationship of being able to push away from gravity and yield back into gravity. This is so early infancy basic. Like, it's the kind of thing that's coded into the body, like as a full-fledged trauma, maybe just as a feeling something's wrong, but it will never come out in talk therapy. Like, you can't articulate those kind of things. You can't articulate that you were never had the range of being able to really, reach for something and grab it into you, like expressing your desire and being able to bring it into yourself. So through movement, you can get at these pieces that underlie a lot of why perhaps a certain experience be highly traumatic to one person and another person will already have enough resilience to meet that with.
That's very interesting. We can advocate the changes and the power of somatic movement and what it can have on your sense of self. Um, but I want to talk for a second about building that mind body connection and sort of the tools that you can have from that to take into your life, into things like nutrition and daily exercise. Do you feel, because we live in a society where these things are often considered to be struggles for a lot of people, nourishing your body with food that makes it feel and run really well, exercising on a daily basis. These things are chores and they're difficult and they're struggles. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that mind body connection, strengthening that, and what that could possibly do for the habits around eating and moving.
Yeah. So what's coming to mind? So part of this is very individual. It really depends on what resonates with a person and what's most effective way for them to move forward. And I work a lot with breathing, but what is really important to breathing that is often neglected is the heart, right? So the heart is surrounded by the lungs, and the heart sits on the diaphragm. So your diaphragm's kind of like a jellyfish that's sort of going like this, and your heart is like, sitting on the jellyfish. So it's getting rocked up and down, and it's also being embraced and released. So even just as we sit here, and this is a short amount of time, but forget about your frontal brain so much. I gave you the information. Feel like you can kind of experience the wideness of the back of your brain. That's where your sensory cortex is. And so just see if you can kind of feel the movement of the heart. So it can be experienced as a breath. It's just really being rocked, right? So notice if that's shifting your experience of yourself towards a little more tenderness, a little bit more softness. So that's a kind of no time exercise. And certainly once you feel the tenderness or softness, you can actually soothe yourself, right? Like, it's okay. Whatever the part is, and I know that in therapy there's a lot of different parts therapy. So people practice inner child, or they practice, family systems, but whatever it is that you just feel is having that longing, right? That unfulfilled need, in a moment, can you soothe that piece? So that is something you can do 100 times a day. And hopefully it's not a chore. Hopefully it's just a recognition that the heart is what is generating your breath. It's calling for oxygen, it's disposing of carbon dioxide, and that heart is not only nourishing you with those chemicals, but that when you start to feel a little bit about that tenderness in your heart, you're making a different chemistry, a different pharmacopoeia. There was a book years ago by Candace Pert, Molecules of Emotion, and just how our emotions are our chemistry. So, did that change your chemistry at all, even in that brief moment?
I think that is a really powerful.
Mhm.
I You're like, oh, you just did something really powerful in 30 seconds. And it's like I
Oh,
didn't have to go anywhere. I didn't have to do anything.
yeah.
And my experience absolutely changed, and um felt like like for me, I'm always like, oh, my shoulders come down just a little bit more, like everything relaxes a little bit, and I never noticed that I've been holding just like even just tension in my body until it starts to relax, and I'm like, whoa, how long were you holding your breath for?
Mhm.
Like, that seems like that was an extended period of time. But even just that practice of, that you just did there just kind of brings us into our bodies and allows that feeling and that connection to really come together. And what a valuable thing to be able to access at any point during the day, because being able to soothe yourself is just one of the most powerful tools that you can have on this planet, right? Like the ability to soothe ourselves. Working on this with a 2-year-old right now. And I'm like, is
Mhm.
this like a traumatic, like, how can she soothe herself? Like, or is it, causing more trauma to not go in there? It's like this whole, back and forth thing that a
And
lot of us are doing all the time.
as a parent, you have to soothe yourself too, because that's like, as a parent, as soon as you suspect your child is in distress, it's like we get like, oh my God, my child's in distress, because, it's like a primordial, like, I have to protect my child. So,
Me and my partner talk about this all the time. He says, like, she goes right back to bed. And we're like, okay. Like, so everyone's up now. It's 3 a.m. And, she's woken up screaming, but she's back to bed and like totally sleeping. But we're like, because you just woke up and now you're just kind of like in a fight or flight, you woke up kind of like anxious, and now trying to like calm that anxiety is really difficult, to even come back down to try to be like, okay, so I could go back to sleep and everyone would live
Yes,
here.
everyone's gonna live. And you know, that's another thing, is that developmentally and anatomically, the front of our body is more connected to the parasympathetic nervous system. And you probably notice in your kid and maybe in yourself too, that when your digestive system is really triggered, it's really harder to calm down. And the digestive system's frontal. So this also relates to vagal nerve soothing, but to just like feel the front of your body, like just again, give it kindness. Just know that there's substance in here. Like you can try it. Like this is your soft, squishy, this is like your mammal body, right? Your back is your hard shell. Your back is like your turtle. So yeah, it's really good for protection and hunkering in. But the front of your body is where you're being nourished from. So how do you in this, and especially so this is less heart and more intestines, but how do you make contact with your intestines in such a way that you're feeling nourished? Like just soft and warm, like you have a puppy or a baby, except that's the puppy or the kitten or the baby is you, and it's real.
Yeah, I think, a lot of people are searching for, the answer when it comes to some of these uncomfortable things we experience in our life, either via, experiences with trauma or actual physical experiences in our body. We have a lot of people in society right now struggling with chronic pain. And, I really think the processing and the toleration of pain is something that I think people are really, really interested in right now with regards to somatic yoga. And can I want to know from you, do you think deepening or sensing techniques can actually help us with something like chronic pain? Can it help us with fears? Can it help us with anxiety?
Yeah. Yeah. So chronic pain and fear and anxiety is an interesting place because in some ways you're already hypersensitive to what you're feeling in your body with all those things. So the key is finding different pathways where you're discovering places of ease and safety. And that again is very individual because you don't want to trip into the wires that lead you down the road of chronic pain or chronic anxiety and fear. There's a series of books. They're graphic comic books. I think it's Pain is Really Strange and Anxiety is Really Strange, both by someone named Steve Haynes. They're like graphic novel comic books, but they explain the latest scientific understanding of how to get out of chronic pain and anxiety. And it has a lot to do with that. I hate to say just a habit because a habit indicates we have volition and these things are not happening with our volition. But there are like well used, well trod pathways that keep us in chronic pain and chronic anxiety. And so with somatic movement and self-sensing, self-feeling, you can lay down new tracks and in that way relieve. But again, you do need to do it carefully because the body is very quick and it can be like, okay, I'm sensing that means my knees are on fire, or whatever the chronic thing is. So it definitely is a little bit more delicate where there's chronic pain and chronic anxiety.
I think you brought up a really great point there, that which like we've talked about in other episodes, where this chronic anxiety and this chronic pain is a very, and I don't want to downplay it in a way of like you're constantly choosing to be in in anxiety, or you're constantly choosing to be in pain.
Who would choose that?
No one is actively choosing that. However, a lot of our behaviors and pathways have been formed to lean us in every one of those directions. And that's why, our response based on our level of resilience, or, how we have practiced our responses, can be in forms of, I respond with an anxious response,
Mhm.
or if you've practiced kind of like responding with more of a positive outlook, or your kind of practiced response is leaning in that direction. And I feel for a lot of people who are experiencing chronic pain and fears and anxiety, and looking for ways to develop new pathways.
Yeah.
And they're looking to things like somatic yoga to be able to develop some of those pathways, and to be able to start kind
Yeah.
of a new response path.
Yeah. Yeah. For a number of years, I worked at, in name drop Massachusetts. I worked at Valley Medical Center in Greenfield, Massachusetts, doing a pain clinic. And so it wasn't like the usual person that would come to yoga classes or meditation classes or anything like that. It was people who it was very new for, very different, and doctors who were at their wits' end. It's like, I can't. It was originally started by a doctor who didn't want to prescribe fentanyl, So I learned a lot. And a lot of it is very foundational about how you interact with what's around you, how you touch yourself, what you're willing to give to yourself, what you surround yourself with. I mean, some people's chronic pain was so bad that movement was not even possible. It was really just, okay, I feel good on the floor and I can actually let myself breathe. Like I remember working with this man who fell off a roof, and I don't know how many bones he broke, but an older man, but who had done manual labor his whole life. And his particular key was, we went imaginally, but then into feeling the little, like, bunches of grapes inside the lung, that where the oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange happens. So instead of getting him to deep breathe or breathe in a particular patterns, it was more like, well, what if these alveoli could actually create your breath? And so he was willing to try it. He was imagining it. And then he was like, I think I'm feeling this. And that released his breath. And that's one of the things we do with somatic movement often, is we give an image. So oftentimes it's just a correct anatomical image, like the two sides of the pelvis doing something different versus squaring the hips. But other times it's more subtle, like, who thinks about the inside of their lungs? But if you could bring an image to that in a way that generates experience, it's very new, it's very fresh, and so it can be a doorway into relieving the pain. Or with anxiety, I've had a lot of success with people just really learning how to ground, not so much as an idea as really feeling the relationship of your body is different in gravity, depending if you're sitting or standing or lying on the floor, what you're lying on the floor against, where's the levity in your body, and feeling the containment of a body. Because another thing with anxiety is that there's often a feeling of being too permeable. Like, there's not a like, this is me, I'm formed here, this is my end. And you get these experiences, and then, well, how do you carry it through? So I've had a number of people who started wearing shawls or blankets. So when they start to feel anxious, and the weighted blanket is this idea too. It's like something that can contain you and give you ground.
That's really super interesting. And I think that it's just an exciting world to dive into, the fact that we have this sort of untapped area of, working with physicality in your body and that mind body connection, to potentially alleviate some of these things that maybe prior to this we thought really had nothing to do with our physical self, and only in doing that sort of these things aren't connected again, and we're just our mind. And I just think it's really exciting for a lot of people to have another option available to be able to tap into, to really find that happiest, healthiest, best self, because we just, we get this one go round. So I want to give you an opportunity to give some of the sources that you have to be able to introduce people to these practices. Where can they hear more from you? Where can they get started?
Great. Well, my website is originalbodywisdom.com because I'm interested in people reclaiming their original body's wisdom. And so originalbodywisdom.com, there are some free courses people can sign up for on there. And I do work remotely with people over Zoom, both individually and in small groups. I work in person in East Hampton, Massachusetts, and I give one-on-one sessions and workshops. There is a walking clinic coming up in October, 3 hours on a Sunday, October 6th. And I have a pelvic floor, which is one of my specialties, workshop coming up December 1st. Also from 1 to 4. So those are in-person workshops. Again, there's free courses online. There's Zoom and in-person one-on-ones. And I have a YouTube channel as well, which is also Original Body Wisdom. And there's a lot of little videos on YouTube. So, yeah.
That's fantastic. Guys, definitely check out any of those resources. I love to hear that you have some specialty in pelvic floor. I was just talking to Rachel about this recently, that I felt like in the last 5 years or so, like there just wasn't that much information about our pelvic floor health, what we can do, how we can recover. And I just feel like there's so much more now. I'm currently 7 months pregnant, and so pelvic floor is a big
Yeah,
thought in my mind.
yeah, yeah,
So I
definitely.
was saying to her, like, I'm so glad so many of these in so many different areas we're addressing the pelvic floor and how important it is, for everyone, but for women specifically, and how we can heal, our pelvic floor. So I'm just like, you're so amazing and doing so many amazing things, and healing the body. I love to hear that there's a specialty there as well.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of good pelvic floor work now. And I know because I have a friend who's a pelvic floor specialist PT, and she was telling me we're finally maybe catching up to Europe a little bit, that, in Europe, when you have a baby, pelvic floor rehab is part of your postpartum treatment and care. And here,
Like,
I had babies. My last baby was in 1990. And postmenopausally, I started developing like problems with my pelvic floor that were there, but I didn't know because I didn't feel them. And I never had, I never had just preemptive care.
yeah, it hasn't been part of the discussion. So I'm just so glad that I know, finally catching up to Europe. It's like, why hasn't this been here? But yeah, it's wild. Guys, definitely check out Donna Brooks. You've been fantastic, Donna. Thank you so much for coming on the
Yeah,
podcast
so
today.
have you too. I've really enjoyed you so much. What a great show.
Oh, thank you.